Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, the definitive edition, was released on November 11, 2021 alongside definitive versions of GTA 3 and GTA Vice City for the PC, Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5, with all three games having set release dates for phones and tablets in the near future. What was originally touted by Rockstar Games as the best versions of these three classics, so much to the point that they had all other versions removed from online stores and replaced by this version, would end up instead being deemed three of the worst video games of all time. This was for many reasons, such as the graphics looking cheap and like plastic, the games all having copious amounts of horrendous glitches, the music selection being downsized, and the list just goes on and on. So, are these claims legitimate, and do these games deserve to be labeled amongst such alumni as Superman 64 and E.T., or are they overblown? Let's find out.
After 5 years on the East Coast,
the story follows Carl Johnson, or CJ for short, who was a member of the Grove Street families in the city of Los Santos until he left for Liberty City after the death of his brother Brian. We join him 5 years later in 1992 as he returns from Liberty City to his home state of San Andreas after learning about the murder of his mother. Upon returning, CJ is immediately apprehended, blackmailed, and left for dead in rival gang territory by crooked police officers Tenpenny and Pulowski. After this, he reconciles with his old friends Big Smoke and Ryder and remaining family members Sweet and Kendall, and while doing so learns about how far down the ladder of power Grove Street has fallen. It is now up to CJ to rebuild his gang, get the cops off his back, find out what's really going on and put a stop to it, and create a statewide criminal empire along the way.
We gotta get back to the hood, man. It's too crazy around here.
The graphics for this version of San Andreas, as stated before in the opening, do indeed look like plastic. At first, when the trailer came out, all three of these games looked like one of those HD 4K mods that would be featured in a YouTube video, but saying that now would be an insult to the modders who created them. I mean, simply put, instead of completely recreating the models and world like a proper remaster should, they instead did the lazy option of just upscaling the original graphics. This is the equivalency of an older person getting Botox or plastic surgery to seem young again, but instead ending up looking worse than they did because of how obviously it was that they had an operation. And that's when only talking about the broad strokes, as there are still the many little things that people started to point out after these games released, such as the character models sometimes being completely off, the clothing not being properly textured, the state of San Andreas looking tiny because of the removal of the fog, and the rain completely blocking out your view. The gameplay is your classic GTA fare with many different hijackable vehicles ranging from the standard cars, bikes, and boats to the harder to get stuff like helicopters, planes, and military vehicles like the tank. And just like any GTA game, there are also many missions to complete, civilians and cops to massacre, collectibles to find, and a whole open world to explore. And believe it or not, this is actually an aspect that hasn't been tampered with at all in this version, or at least when it works properly, I should say. Now, I do have to admit that in my experience while playing this game, that not that many glitches had occurred and that it only crashed a few times. But that doesn't mean that all the other discovered glitches don't exist to me because I didn't personally experience them. Some of the more infamous glitches include characters dying in a cutscene, thus failing the mission, car models increasing in size, randomly being flung into the air, and randomly falling through the ground. For the version of a game that claims to be the definitive edition, you'd think that for the most part that the controls would be mostly the same, but with a few changes here and there to help modernize them. And to that end, you would be somewhat right. What was done correctly was the inclusion of the GTA 5-esque weapon/radio selection wheels. Now, you don't have to cycle through every single weapon or radio station one at a time to get what you want. But of course, like other aspects of this game, the controls have been screwed up a bit. What is broken in this department includes the running being delayed, the addition of an auto jump, and the aiming system now being fidgety. When you try to run, it will take Carl a second or two to start sprinting, which can easily cause you to die if you are trying to run away from, say, a flipped over car that was about to explode. Next, we have the auto jump, which is just annoying since whenever you start running near a wall, Carl is forced to jump and try and grab it. This one is at least forgivable as you can turn it off in the options menu, but it really shouldn't exist to begin with. Lastly is the fidgetification of the aiming system, as I could just never get it to aim at the right person or properly switch targets. But I gotta say, my favorite part is when it stays aimed on a dead enemy without auto switching to a live one. There are many diverse missions in San Andreas, ranging from the simplistic to the honestly pretty wacky. Of course, there still are the standard story missions in which the objectives could just be needing to kill a set of enemies, drive someone somewhere, or to protect/save someone. But then there's the missions that are just full-blown outlandish, as they will have you flying an armed toy plane to destroy rival vans, burning weed fields before the cops arrive, stealing a jetpack from a secret military base, and then using said jetpack to steal alien goo from a train. And despite how unbelievable they are, I can't help but still love them. Then there are the side missions where you can participate in street races, find and export special cars, take over gang territory, go to boating school, or even work as a valet driver. Lastly, I should say that outside of making some missions needlessly easier, that all of them are the same way they were since day one. When you think about it, the difficulty in GTA games come down to memorization, preparedness, and a bit of luck. Memorizing and perfecting the objectives and the missions, the prep of what weapons you will use and what upgrades you will unlock to have an easier time, and the luck of not having an enemy or vehicle spawn in a place that will result in your death or the failure of the mission. Having said that, San Andreas overall is definitely one of the easier games in the series. But this statement is only true about the other versions of San Andreas, as this version, on the other hand, has a major flaw that makes it unnecessarily difficult. This flaw being that the enemy AI has improved aiming, something that was definitely intentionally toned down in the other versions because of how much damage the weapons do and how easily they could have mowed you down. However, this issue is somewhat negated because this version of the game does come with mission checkpoints, allowing you to save your weapons if you are wasted and your progress in the missions if you were to fail them. All GTA games tend to follow the same formula when it comes to the music that they feature. First is that there are very few pieces of music made in-house. These are usually chalked up to the game's theme song that plays over the intro, the music that plays over the credits, and a few pieces of music spread throughout, such as after a successful attempt at a mission. Second is the overabundance of licensed music from the decade, in this case the early 90s, from many different genres that were popular at the time, with this game being home to alternative rock, gangster rap, country, and much more. These licensed songs are played on the in-game radio stations alongside the bonus comedic parody commercials, radio hosts, and even talk shows. Third is being able to put your own music into the games, regardless of it being time period appropriate or it even being music at all, but to my knowledge this feature is only available in certain versions of these games. Now, for these supposedly perfected versions, the first and third types of music are untouched, but the second type on the other hand has a bit of an issue. You see, when a game with licensed music gets re-released, there's a chance that some of the licensing agreements will most likely have expired, resulting in that music having to be removed from the new version of the game. Of course, this is what happened with all three of these games, with this game in particular losing Hellraiser, Express Yourself, Running Down a Dream, and more. Now, I don't know if these agreements could have been renewed, and if they couldn't have, then there was nothing Rockstar could have done in this situation. But if they could have been renewed, then the limited soundtrack in these totally best versions of the classic GTAs is completely on them. So, to answer the question of if these games are deserving of their titles as three of the worst video games of all time, I would say yes. But before I can continue, I do need to give two disclaimers. One is that I do acknowledge that I am projecting my judgment onto the other two games in both this conclusion and in some parts of the review, despite only having played San Andreas. And despite not being a fan of critiquing a game without playing it, I do believe that I have seen enough evidence in this situation to do so. And two is that I played this relatively close to when it first came out, so most of the glitches and problems were still intact and had not yet been fixed. Having said this, I do believe that Rockstar fixing these games is a step in the right direction, but I also believe that this gesture just comes off as too little too late, because these definitive versions should have never released in the broken state that they were in to begin with. And the few things that were done for the better are easily lost within the tsunami wave of all the negative traits that these versions harbor. If anything, this whole incident just shows how far gone Rockstar are with them releasing these broken games and expecting us to just sit here and take it. Hopefully this was a wake-up call for them, but somehow I doubt it. And with that all said, I think that it's pretty obvious by now that I would not recommend this version of San Andreas or really any of these three poorly remastered titles. Thanks for watching.
See you around.
officer.